Hello, everybody. I think we're going to start, and hopefully some more people will join us in a sec. In this session, we're going to be talking about management and specifically how do we learn from each other when it comes to managing professionals on the autism spectrum. I want to talk a little bit about best practices and learnings, and then also how people have collaborated so far, given that I think particularly in an office environment, managing in one particularly big corporate is likely to be similar in terms of the skill set to managing in another. And then first of all, actually going to have the panelists introduce themselves and then ask them some questions and then get some questions from you guys. James, do you want to go first?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here on a third day in a row. I know the crowd's dwindling as people start leaving. I'm James Mahoney. I head up Autism at Work for JP Morgan Chase. Good to see you again.
And good morning again, everyone. My name is Jamel Mitchell from EY. I serve as our neurodiversity operations leader. And again, to James' point, thank you guys for coming back for now day 3, hoping to learn as much as you can on this topic.
Hi, and I'm Marcia Shiner. I am the president and founder of Integrate Autism Employment Advisors, and we work with employers such as my panelists here to help them identify, recruit, and retain professionals on the autism spectrum.
Thanks, guys. And just to introduce myself, I'm Ed Thompson from Optimize, and we are building digital tools to support neurodiversity in the workplace. And I'm excited about this panel. We have, I think, 3 of the ideal people at this conference to talk about this subject, including Marcia, who literally wrote the book on it. So I'm going to start. I want to start with Marcia, and everybody, I think, has got a copy of her book. We used her book extensively in the latest version of our training. She was kind enough to make it available for that. But I wanted to ask, kind of, what would you say is the key message, the key takeaway? This is the age of the tweetable soundbite. What do you think people can, the key things you want people to learn from the book?
Okay, well, I can't promise that I'll be able to say it in 280 characters, but I think we've heard a lot over the past day and a half, I guess, about soft skills training and training in the programs that's been built in for individuals on the spectrum coming into the workplace. I think one of the key messages and the takeaways, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, was that the whole process of employing people on the spectrum from a training and an education perspective is very much a two-way street. And that the education and training for employers, hiring managers, the recruiters, the interviewers, anybody who's going to be involved in the process or touch and come into contact with a colleague on the spectrum is extremely important. And that the obligation to train and educate and understand the behavioral differences and challenges that you will see on individuals in the spectrum who come into your workplace is very much upon the employers who are bringing those individuals in. You can train individuals on the spectrum in soft skills and in other skills, and they have tremendous capacity to learn because, as we know, they are incredibly talented and smart. But at the end of the day, they have autism, and they are always going to have issues related to autism. You cannot train those away. And as managers and individuals working with people on the autism spectrum, you are going to encounter behavioral differences and work performance and learning style differences in the workplace that you're going to be unfamiliar with. And part of what we tried to get across in the way in which we wrote the book and the style of the book was that it's okay that you don't understand these things. And it's okay that they seem a bit odd to you. But that it's okay to then raise your hand and ask questions and say, I don't understand, I need help knowing what to do, right, and how I should do it appropriately. So that when you're doing these things, these programs, you should make sure you have the right partners in place as an employer, not only to make sure you're providing the training and the support to the employees, but you're providing the training and the support to your managers and your teams who are not on the spectrum who are working with their new employees.
Right. So as a manager, don't expect your employees to kind of act like a neurotypical or become a neurotypical. There's an onus on you as a manager to meet them halfway. But as an employer, we're going to help you as a manager to do that. We're going to equip you to be successful. You're not there on your own. So Jamel, first question for you is, what have you learned about managing professionals on the spectrum in your program at EY?
So one of the things that we have definitely learned is that obviously when a person has a diagnosis, it's not something that, to your point, Marsha, you can actually train away. I think it really requires that the manager, the counselor, the supervisor, whatever term you use for your company, will have to make sure that they are as nimble and that they are constantly evolving their skill set
Right.
in order to meet the need of the individual. It's something as simple as explaining maybe once what this person what they should do, but being able to have that conversation again, maybe using different language so that he or she actually gets it and it sinks in. But the reality is that we've seen, at least with individuals within our program, is that we may have to have that conversation, 6 months from now, and then some of those reminders and kind of helping to reinforce different tools that would help them be successful. So as an example, we have deadlines as to when timesheets are supposed to be submitted. Some of our neurotypicals actually just remember that innately, but for some individuals on the spectrum, we have had to go back and say, hey guys, as a reminder, you have to do this by this time. We think you should put actually a post-it. We think that every day you should actually incorporate this as an automatic, before you sign off, you need to look at this sheet in order to make sure that you've done these different things that are on the checklist. And that has proven to be successful with some, maybe not as successful with others. So it's really just making sure that you are very nimble and that you are helping to cultivate what your style is to incorporate some of that difference that individuals on the spectrum can bring.
Right, so it's not just clicking a switch. We're talking about building skills and capability kind of over time.
And it's constant
and
learning,
together, right?
definitely. And I
Yeah.
think one of the interesting things is that even when you have individuals that have been managing for years, this is a different way, a different kind of management. So it requires that your skill set evolves.
So James, to bring you in and talk, because one of the themes of this session is collaboration, and you're part of the employer roundtable. Can you talk a little bit about how you are collaborating as a group now, and in particular, is there anything around manager support that you could give us an example of collaboration there?
Yeah, so one of the beautiful things about the roundtable is that from the very beginning, before we were an official roundtable, we were speaking openly about challenges and being transparent about where we had difficulties, and it allowed us to focus on things like the necessity of preparing our typical community, in particular managers. And I like the word that Marsha used, obligation, right? And I liked Jamel and Ed talking about long-term managers. And one of the things we talked about was, and we're all guilty of this as managers, the longer we've managed, the more we think we have everything figured out. We know what works for us stylistically, practicably. We know all of the things that make things work with people, and we think we know it all. But you're thrown for a loop when you're presented with people on the autism spectrum. I'm supposed to be one of the leading thinkers in my company about autism, and I still struggle interviewing people on the spectrum, right? Even though I'm supposed to know the most. So this collaboration very specifically allows us to talk through this. It's supplemented by Ed, your video training, supplemented further by Marsha's book. And we do rely heavily on that. And what was the phrase we used yesterday, Tom's presentation, permission to care?
Yeah.
Well, I give myself and I give our managers permission to not know it all when it comes to autism, because we're on that journey of learning. So I rambled a little bit, but hopefully wove together some of the components.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's why we have these sessions, and that's why this kind of event is so valuable, that we certainly believe nobody has all the answers. And I want to bring in the audience, fairly soon, because I think in all of these sessions there's so much expertise in the audience as well as the panel. So just coming back this way, Jamel, what's been the biggest challenge of preparing managers to be successful in this area, or what have been some of the challenges, and maybe how have you overcome those?
So I would say at the moment, we haven't had a huge challenge within the management space directly, because I'm privileged, if you will, to have one of my colleagues here, 18 years with the firm, who has just as much passion about this space, as I do. We are privileged to have another person who literally signed up and raised their hand, who has many of the skills that we would be looking for that would make a person successful. But I would say what I perceive as a potential challenge is if anyone is kind of like shoved in this space and said that you have to do this based upon what would be a firm initiative, because I think that it requires a certain amount of care, and there's a balance between making sure that you kind of check the box, but you really, to Jane's point, have really the opportunity, or you have permission to care as well as permission to not know it all. Oftentimes when you have management that has been in place for several years, you come from a premise of, I know the culture, I know the company, I've been managing for 10, 15, 20 years, I think I have it. And when you're thrown these curveballs, it creates a level of uncomfortability that many of us don't want to acknowledge within the workplace, but it's something that we actually have to work through in order to make sure, again, that we're more inclusive and that we really bring an environment of I don't know to the forefront, and that being okay within every workplace.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of a theme that it's about an ongoing development of skills and confidence, and not something that anybody has immediately. Is that a question?
Yeah, just
Sure.
to kind of piggyback off that, what kind of outside resources, or maybe it's internal, as an employer, do you utilize to push that ongoing needle with managers? If you have multiple managers from different teams that have folks on the spectrum, what are you utilizing?
Yeah, so we utilize video training. Well, first we do classroom training that's very general awareness level stuff for an intro to autism for managers and colleagues. But supplementing that is the video work that Ed's Optimize organization does, which is very situational and specific, like Marcia's book, and that helps. But I think it also has to be a conversation, sometimes between me and the manager if there's a very specific problem going on. And these are the things that we're trying to do now, but we realize we have more room to grow there if that helps. Yeah.
And similarly, if I can add on to that, we do, the basic, this is autism awareness, and this is some training that will be helpful for you to understand more broadly about, individuals on the spectrum. But we go a little bit deeper, wherein when individuals come on, we have them share with us different things that may make them angry, different ways that they actually learn more successfully, and we share that information prior to them being aligned with teams. That way it actually helps for that conversation to flow more organically. But we also definitely have utilized Marcia's book. We shared it with the managers that are helping to run the program, as well as those that are interested within the program.
And one of the things that we do when we go in and we do training, we do sort of multiple levels of training with an employer when they're hiring. So we'll go in and we'll do higher level training before they start the interview process, and make sure that there's a baseline of understanding of autism and how it will present, and focus particularly on what will appear and how to deal through the interview process. And then once candidates are selected, we'll go back and we'll do much more in-depth training about specific behaviors that may appear in the workplace, and then create scenario-based trainings where the scenarios are really drawn from an understanding of each individual candidate, so that we can, before a candidate even starts or right at the very beginning of their employment, work through with the team and the managers sort of, this may happen, how do you handle it, sort of what could go wrong, and then how do you handle that, and sort of give them a sense of comfort that they've at least thought through some of the challenges that might be particular to that individual, because, I'm sure as you've all heard, every single person on the spectrum is going to be different, and everybody's challenges and issues are going to be different. So we then, sort of do that on a person-by-person basis through the scenario-based training to give the employer really sort of a drilled down level of training.
Yeah, sorry, just because training is kind of our area, just to talk to that as well. I think just as nobody has all of the answers, there isn't kind of any one resource that is, that is it, right? And what you're trying to do is use this training to not just kind of create, build individual skills and build confidence, but create a conversation. So people are actually discussing in that organization, okay, how does this relate to our situation? So, we are working, for example, with Marcia and Integrate, where they will do some face-to-face training and we will provide the kind of on-demand online resources. And I came out here a couple of years ago and talked to Neil and Jen, said we are looking to build this kind of training. And they welcome that not as a kind of a replacement of the rest of the support that they had in their program, but as a useful addition within that kind of tool set. So I think that's kind of the way we're going. Did we have a Skype question? Yeah, sorry, we're just gonna, they get priority, it seems, so. Yeah. Yeah. And when we get questions, can everyone just say, name and role each time? I think it's a great question. I'm going to throw it to the panel.
It's so great. You should answer it. It's a really wonderful question.
Well, my first answer, and then while these guys are thinking, would be it's situational, but it's not situational training in that here is situation X and kind of here is what you do. So I liken it to teaching someone how to play soccer. There isn't a hard rule that if you're in this position of the field and you receive the ball, you kick it 5 yards to the right. It doesn't work like that. So what you're trying to do is equip people to be successful in changing scenarios within this kind of framework. And that's why scenarios are useful, is because they're giving you examples from which you can kind of glean some rules and approaches.
And I think part of the unknown is embracing the fact that there's a continuum that doesn't end, if you will, in terms of that learning, and that respects the breadth and the endlessness of the spectrum itself. So I don't know that we ever finish or we can ever definitively find situation in, and that's okay. I think what that does, if you're open to it, it invites you to always be questioning yourself, giving confidence, if you will, or respect, or other things to the person you're managing, and you leave some answers or some questions unanswered. And I think that's okay, but it allows you to support. And I know I've answered that conceptually a little bit, but it does keep that openness, and I think that's important.
There's also just the kind of different levels is how we think about it, because if you have a manager who knows that they have an autistic direct report, that's one situation. But a lot of the time, people don't walk around with labels on their head. So really what we're trying to do is teach managers to be inclusive off the bat and acknowledge that everybody thinks in a different way and get those processes right. And then in the individual case, it's always going to be incredibly individualized. And so then having the willingness to say, okay, what is it specifically with you? How can we change how we work to be successful?
And I think, one of the things we oftentimes say is that a good portion of the management strategies are just generally good management strategies. So, and they apply to everybody. And it's about good, clear, concise, effective communication. Now, granted, there will be situations that are related specifically to someone being on the autism spectrum that will be different, and then you have to understand and adjust for those. But, to the extent that you're being clear with individuals about timeframes and priorities and deadlines and what your expectations are, and that you're giving very clear feedback, that's applicable to anybody on the spectrum, and frankly applicable to anybody who works for you. So that, that's sort of one way that we deal with it. And I think the other way, in both the way I structured the book when it was written, and sort of the advice that we give, and the way that I believe Ed's training is structured, is that it allows for a manager who we all acknowledge has limited time, and wants to address issues in the moment, is that you can quickly go either to the book or to the training and say, this is the issue that came up, and I quickly need to learn about a specific type of challenge or behavior that I need to deal with. And you can look to the table of contents of our book, or you can go down the menu for Ed's training. You can find a video that's addresses just that, and you can quickly learn about that and then move on and deal with that. And that allows you to address the fact that you don't, need to watch 2 hours of training or read a whole book to deal with one issue that's specific to one person on the spectrum.
And to add on to that, just real quickly, one of the things I would say, specifically to the question is, it's not about making the assumptions, it's right. It's like looking at each situation from an individual perspective, and it's really calling out the elephant in the room and reminding managers that we can't make assumptions because a person is on the spectrum. So I love, Marsha, what you said about the clear and concise communications. I love the fact that, there are some unknowns that are out there, but being honest with those who are managing to say, hey, you know what, are you making an assumption, or do you have all the facts? And if we have all the facts, we can actually deal with that from a situational perspective, whether it be by video or going to a book and actually leveraging past experiences that could help. But it's not about making the assumptions, and that would be beneficial for anyone that's on the spectrum, that has any diagnosis, any race, any color.
Yeah, I think just to summarize kind of a theme of so far is that you can't really just, take somebody from zero to mastery before they get into the arena, right? And so you're looking to give them tools and support while they're there that they can use. Yeah. There's one there as well.
Yeah, wonderful. Hi, Lou Candiello with Dell, and so I've been putting together an autism program for the past 2 years. We're trying to launch in a couple of weeks. We'll have our first individuals starting as summer interns in June, and a lot of thanks to SAP and Microsoft for helping me down the path. So I had an executive approach me. She has a son on the spectrum, and she asked me the question, how do you know you have the right managers to start your program with? What are the competencies that are necessary other than good intentions? Which scared me because I was like, that's a very valid point. We start with people with good intentions. Dell being a technology company, a lot of our managers or leaders aren't necessarily leaders, right? They're very good at technical components to the role, may have the good intentions of someone starting in the program and trying to work with the autism. But how does Lou, sitting in talent acquisition, understand the measurement of the manager as we progress through the program and their capabilities to be good at this and make this successful? How do we scorecard the managers? I know that there's a lot of rigor around management systems, performance management, and all these other sorts of things large companies have, but we're moving away from that at Dell EMC. We're doing something completely different. So how does I go to sleep at night knowing that my folks in my cohort are doing and my managers are performing to the role that I'm asking them to take on?
So it's the hardest thing, and it's harder in technology, I think. So I'll make some blunt statements about managers, and being a manager, it applies to myself as well. Sometimes we're not crisp communicators, especially when we're telling Lou that you're not doing something right or it could be better, and we beat around the bush. And so that's the first ingredient I look for in a manager as I'm working with leaders on who's going to manage the resources. Because we want someone who can be very precise, very direct, polite, have an inner compassion and care and a patience. So these are hard and soft abilities that we look for. It's a very short list, but hard to find. So in some ways, that's the easy part. And we keep it to be a small list, and also the manager has to be co-located. That's another big ingredient for us. So fine, we find those managers, and knock on wood, we've been okay with it. What kills us is the reorg in 6 months, and nobody tells me, right? They don't ask my opinion, and all of a sudden, Susie has a new manager, and they're not compassionate. They're kind of rude. They're very oblique in their communication, and that's where we have to step in and retrain, and then that's where it deteriorates a little bit. So I think if you keep to those ingredients I mentioned in the beginning, it gets you started. But you have to keep checking in. And Lou, I think that does become part of your job to occasionally find that checkpoint. Yeah?
And I would like to add on to that, Lou, as you're looking for, that manager, that leader, that person they have to have a natural ability to be extremely nimble. I use that term often at EY. So you can have a person that has the competency, that have managed or that has served as a leader or a counselor for years. But if the person is so rigid in their approach and so kind of like married to, we have to do it this way, and are unwilling to kind of look at things differently, in most cases, that person would not be successful managing individuals, in our experience with folks on the spectrum.
I think my question was more of the good intention found someone that I think will do well at this, and then they don't. How do I measure in process and screen that this manager is not going to make this person successful?
How do you measure that they're not going to do it?
Standing in the back somewhere, I don't have any scorecards. I've got scorecards and cohort assessments for the candidates coming in. How am I scorecarding my managers to make sure?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So we had a question that was kind of related to this at this dinner that.
Repeat the question. They can't hear. Repeat the question for the audience, for the Skype.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So do you want to repeat your question, and then I'll.
Sure. No, I'm sorry to put such a fine point on this, but so I've got assessments in how I define who will come into the roles on the autism spectrum. I've got good intentioned managers that I think will do a good job, but how do I scorecard my managers against their success with these individuals on the spectrum? Like, how do I know that they are performing the way I need them to perform in this environment?
Right. So something we would do is, when we put people through training, is then potentially give them a kind of a credentialing, so that we know where they are in terms of their familiarity with the subject, and you're building their expertise that way. In terms of how you specifically want them to perform in your context, that's something, in a sense, you also kind of have to monitor. But relating to that, I think, is a question we had yesterday, which was around, is there ever a situation where, you have a manager who you're kind of afraid to give an autistic employee because you just don't think, maybe they'd be right? And my answer to that would be to see it as a positive, and to Marsha's point, that I think learning to manage autistic people can be a way to become a better manager, to embrace that and put that person on that path to developing those skills. We had a Skype question, and it's just getting waved at the back. So it's great to see so many hands going up. So one more of these, and then.
Yep. This is from Boaz once again. Any of the employers currently providing or contemplating avenues of employment inclusion of a growing population of autistic college graduates that are non-speaking?
I'll put that to Jamel and James.
We have not figured it out. We've not encountered a candidate yet. We haven't figured it out. I'm open to the possibility, with the right assistive technology, for the person to come in, and whether that assistive technology is helping non-speaking, or if the person's a visual thinker, there might be multiple assistive technologies. It's something that we do envision. Much like I said in the previous days, we envision going deeper into the spectrum as well for different parts of the organization.
And from an EY perspective, we haven't encountered that as of yet, but we do have technology that would assist if a person had some challenges from a nonverbal perspective, but we haven't encountered any employees that have the skill set that we're looking for that are also, would classify within that space.
Let's have another question. Yeah, at the back. Oh, yeah, whoever's got the
Okay,
mic.
thanks. Hi, I'm Chet Hurwitz. I'm with Ventures ATL, a nonprofit in Atlanta that employs adults on the spectrum. My question is taking this in a slightly different direction, and that is that in many of your organizations, we know there are individuals on the spectrum who do not participate in the quote program, close quote. Jamel, I'm thinking of your company. I'm a former PwC partner, and I know that there were, but prior to any program, there are many professionals on the spectrum. So I'm wondering what your experience has been to support those individuals, or any ripple effect you've seen as a result of the introduction of a formal program on what I might call the pre-existing population of employees who are on the spectrum.
So I think that that is a excellent question, one, but we haven't seen any specific individual that actually comes out and says that they are on the spectrum and they are in need of any support. But differently, we have seen individuals come out and share with us that they have other cognitive differences. Like we had a couple of partners actually share with us that they themselves are dyslexic, as well as some of their children. There are, I would say, some assumptions that people could make about those that work within our technology space, as well as some of our accountants that may be on the spectrum, but no one has specifically come out and said, hey, I'm autistic and I would love to be a part, or I see that this particular employee is getting this type of support. Would that be available for me as well?
We have, Chet, had people reveal, self-disclose, and typically I make an open-ended offer to them. Is there anything we can provide you that will make you do your best work? And we're starting to do that for every recruit we make, regardless of if we know there's anything going on. Right. And what I think that does is it's an implied invitation for an accommodation so that we get people with an invisible situation. And I think that's a good practice for us to be doing. Now, part of your question was, have people taken us up on the offer? Yes, mostly through mentorship, EAP sometimes with somebody who's very anxious about a situation. But I'm glad they're coming to us. I think it's a benefit that they're opening up. And of course, we should be offering whatever we can to help them.
We actually run a program called Employer Connect. It's a networking program where we bring groups of young adults who are college students and graduates to network with different companies. And through that program, we have had employees at those companies that have hosting us disclose that they are on the spectrum, whether it's ones who have volunteered to participate in the program, or just because they've heard about it, that they've then felt comfortable coming forward in their employer and disclosing that they're on the spectrum. Some of those companies have then looked to have additional training at their companies. So, just the fact that, what we see is that when companies engage in inclusive activities around autism, whether it's, going through the activity of having a formal program to hire people, or even just starting the process of introducing activities like this Employer Connect program, it does send out that message internally, and employees who are on the spectrum who do work there do start coming forward to disclose.
I just echo that with our work with Microsoft in particular. We've really seen that, and I think it wasn't something we had envisioned as much as it would happen, but exactly, employees that see that their organization has become this kind of beacon for neurodiversity inclusion, I think, have that confidence to disclose proactively, and then you have that conversation and provide the support. So yeah.
It's only the right side of the room asking questions.
At the back in the middle there, yeah. Go for it.
Hi. So I'm from Carnegie Mellon University. My name's Val. This is Catherine. Catherine's also from Carnegie Mellon. I work in the Career and Professional Development Center, but prior to my role, I worked in human resources for a corporate retailer. And a lot of times, I think what we see when we work in an organization that doesn't have the awareness is we don't really find out about it until it's a performance issue. Mm-hmm. And at that point, it's really hard to work with a manager to turn it around, to get them to kind of change their perspective and open up, because they're just kind of frustrated at that point because the work's not getting done. Can you talk a little bit about, in the early stages of the programs prior to really seeing success and growth, how you navigated some of those situations and some of the strategies or allies that you brought in to the situation to support that individual and help to turn that performance around?
Yeah, so any situations of managers kind of being in difficulty, and then how did you?
So Val,
How
you're
did you change
talking
that?
kind of not hires through the program maybe, but mid-flight there's a performance issue and somebody says, oh, I'm on the spectrum or I have ADHD or whatever, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
so we've run into that a couple of times, and what we've done is, you know, if the employee mentions it, the HR clears that I can talk to the employee maybe, or to the manager, make sure everyone's okay with disclosure, first step. Second step, make sure that we infuse some training for the manager to say, now that you know the disclosure, now that you have some more information about autism, is there anything you want to rethink in terms of how you proceed, how you set the person up for success? What accommodations can you make? Look, the job requirements are the job requirements. If you have to write good Java code, there's no getting around that. But if you have to accommodate things for a visual thinker that requires assistive technology so they can take text and create visual pictorial diagrams, that's something you can do if that's what their struggle is. And that's what the conversation centers around: accommodation versus performance. I hope that helps.
And from an EY perspective, we haven't had that situation where we found out after the fact that someone actually was on the spectrum, so everyone actually self-discloses. But we've had some situations that have involved employees that were not performing at optimal levels, and that's one of the things that we actually use a job and or life coach to assist with those conversations, as well as bringing in what we identify as people consultants, which is standard HR, to be brought into the conversation earlier on, as well as the documentation that would be necessary for any employee to make sure that there is good tracking, that there's good examples that are provided, as well as milestones that that person will be able to assist within changing that behavior, as opposed to just getting frustrated because you haven't had the conversation.
And we had one client that, while they had some disclosed employees on this, it wasn't a formal program, but they had some disclosed employees on the spectrum in this certain division. They brought in one employee through their traditional campus recruiting process who, after he was on board, disclosed he was on the spectrum, and he was in a team that knew nothing about autism. And they were becoming extremely frustrated with some of his behaviors, and they had no idea what to do about it. So we came in and we did a training for his team, and after that, things got much better. And I'll tell you, largely what we did was give them permission to tell him what the rules were around behavior. You know, because one of the things he did when he disclosed was he became a strong advocate internally for people on the autism spectrum, which was fine, but he was spending so much time on it, he was doing it to the detriment of his job. And nobody really, you know, they didn't feel comfortable sitting down and telling him that he had to do his job first. And that he couldn't send emails directly to the CEO about this. So, once we said to him, and it was very simple. We said, well, have you told him he can't do that? And their response was, we can do that. And we're like, yeah, you can do that. That's sort of,
That's the
that's a
key.
social rule of your organization. You can do that. And once, they understood all of that and were able to give him direct, appropriate feedback, he took it. He said, oh, okay, fine. And things were fine after that.
I can't emphasize enough the simplicity of the correction sometimes. So the one I explained earlier was more complex, right? But we've got a young joiner. He was singing at his desk, being extremely loud. Henry, he's on a podcast interview done by Adam Grant from TED Talk. It's out there, episode 8. He's amazing. But nobody knew he was on the autism spectrum, and he's singing at his desk, talking very loud, being very disruptive, getting dirty looks, missing the dirty looks entirely, and finally his manager, knew about it, and well, what can I do? And I said, tell him to be quiet. Tell him to lower his voice. Tell him not to sing. Go outside and sing, right? He did that. Henry's great. He's like employee of the month. He's doing great. Simple, simple correction.
And James, just to add on again, it is those simple instructions that we think that, oh my God, I can't believe that is that simple. We have, different office managing partners within different regions. And again, one of my colleagues is here. We had an employee earlier on, he would just come by and go into the office managing partner's office and just chit chat, like, hey, how's things going? And we had to tell him, listen, you cannot do that. This man is extremely busy. Every minute is accounted for, and his bill rate is X. Oh, and it was simple as that, and he doesn't do it anymore. So he speaks when he comes by and he actually have casual conversation, but it's those simple rules that we really just take for granted that we need to help to reinforce and just communicate.
Great. Any questions? Lawrence?
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, there
Okay,
was one
yeah.
other over here. My name's Catherine Getchell. I'm the Director of Disability Resources at Carnegie Mellon. And just a quick comment on what you were talking about feedback. We try to do a lot of education for our campus community, and we use the words expected rather than that's not appropriate, maybe saying to someone, that's not the expected behavior. Because appropriate's a little bit of a loaded term sometimes. They've probably heard a lot in their growing up, that's not appropriate, that's not appropriate. And so we say, that's not expected. What is expected is this other thing. But I also had a question, getting back to your preparation and training for managers, and I think that's a really key part of the process, but I also wonder, so we run a career readiness program for students on the spectrum, and I wonder what would be your request for us as a university as we prepare our students with autism in the realm of self-advocacy, in educating their own managers and working with their own managers. How can we best prepare our students so that they are prepared to work with that manager who might not be as familiar with autism or might not be as warm to the process?
One of the quick things that I would say is just what you're doing as far as that ability to self-advocate. I think it's so important that they are able to share what's going to work best for them within the workplace.
And I think, Catherine, adding to that, you have to have the disclosure, whether to disclose or not, conversation with the candidate. Because on one hand, disclosing to the prospective employer prepares the prospective employer to interview correctly. And I think that's important. And I've met with too many people who I say, do you disclose? And they say yes. I ask when. They say when they sit down in the interview chair. You've given that interviewer no chance of successfully getting at what you're good at. So that, I think, is an important part of the conversation. And then, of course, I'm presuming that you're doing things in conjunction with career services to make sure that autism does not become their headline, that I'm a great Java programmer becomes the headline. Hey, I have some quirks with autism, I have body tics, nothing to be alarmed at, right? Get it out of the way and go on. Talk about advocacy for autism if that's part of what you champion. But create that story of your whole self, not autism as the headline.
And the only thing I would add, and what we tell the young adults that we work with when we're sending them on, is not only do you want to tell an employer about how autism impacts you, but you want to tell them what the solution is for you so that you can be effective at work. If any employer, and this isn't just related to autism, but as an employee, when you come with an issue, you want to come with the solution. That's what makes you a valuable employee to any employer. So understand yourself, understand it answers the question, what are your, we all get the what are your strengths and weaknesses question in an interview. Well, okay, it's a weakness. We all have weaknesses. I struggle here, but if I can be given this in my environment, if I get clear instructions and my tasks are broken down for me, I do really well. So as long as they understand what their challenges are and what solutions they need in order to be successful.
Yeah, I think this is the kind of meeting halfway ideal, that we can educate managers to be willing to take feedback and actually think, how do I become a better manager? Ask your employee. And the ideal is that the employee has a familiarity or confidence or even a training in how to self-advocate for themselves and the self-knowledge to say, these three things are going to help me be successful. Lawrence, yeah.
I'm Lawrence Fong from Stanford University. I'm a psychiatrist. We are starting a hiring program at Stanford within university IT department, and Thank you for doing all the good work so that we have examples to follow. So the question is about whether or not there are systematic way of really characterizing managers and see how they are doing and whether or not there are managers that have characteristics that are actually better at managing people on the spectrum, or maybe the other way.
We don't. We don't, and I don't know, Lawrence. I don't know that we should. Would be my honest answer, because we need managers who can manage lots of diversity, cognitive, racially, ethnically, everything. And because of Lou's point earlier, what about the reorg? You know, you get a new manager. So manager has to fit across the broadest of spectrums and just be great with people is the umbrella Allah part of it.
And just to add on to that, it was so funny. We actually discussed this last night at dinner, and we were talking about, you know, if there are certain characteristics that you think that a person that's on the spectrum would list out that makes a person effective. If you ask a neurotypical person the same question, if you ask a female the same question, an African American, Hispanic individual the same question, you may get very much the same types of answers, because when you're in a management or a leadership role, the expectation is that you're able to do that seamlessly across all of your team, regardless of whether or not they have a diagnosis or how they classify.
Are we time out? Yeah. All right.
May I just make a quick comment?
Yeah.
How sessions later on, and a big part of what we're going to talk about is actually managers as leaders, and we'll discuss that leadership behavior based on much evidence that Mr. Ronald and James just said, and what I was saying, those leadership behavior that are universal across most marginalized populations, also dominant populations. What are the specific characteristics and behaviors that not just managers, but team members should be trained to be aware of? We're going to talk a little bit about that, and that's based on much leadership literature. So thank you.
Great. So thanks to everyone, and particular thanks to our panelists.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your sessions. Take care.